welcome Paul Hertneky here, who's going to talk process and questions, any questions you have about the book. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Paul.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you for being forced to read my book. I think everyone should be forced to read my book. You know, in a perfect world, maybe that would be the thing. We talked about that in workshop today. I have this thing about voluntary and involuntary readers. And that's the shocking thing when you go out there into the world of publishing, is that suddenly you're not writing for involuntary readers anymore. You're writing for people who can read one paragraph and put it back on the shelf, or go get a sandwich, or throw it in the trash and owe you no explanation whatsoever. But by the time you get there, you're kind of ready for that. So, and for people who have published in small places and in places where you feel like there are enthusiastic readers waiting for you, or you're capturing them with something, it's a great way to get used to the idea that you have to grab people's eyelids and drag them down to the page and hold them there, or else they're gone forever. So anyway, thank you. It's very gratifying to be in this position. And anything you want to know, let's just begin. I'm not going to guess. Because there are a lot of gaps, I'm sure. Yes,
Okay, so
Sonia.
I'll start with a big question.
Okay.
Can you describe because the book is so comprehensive in terms of, just the time period and the context and history. What was the gestation period like for the book, and then, including research and then the writing of it? What was that whole process like?
Well, the gestation period was, about 55 years. I wouldn't recommend that, by the way. No, I think that because I had come from writing journalism and writing short essays, I had never really thought of writing a book. I really didn't. It was not a goal of mine. My friends were writing books. I saw what it was doing to them. I saw their books on remainder tables. It seemed horribly heartbreaking. And why in God's name would anyone do that? And then in about 2006, I think it was, I had the encounter that I described in the beginning of the book. And I realized that someone had to write about this place. And I guess it was going to be me, because there weren't a whole hell of a lot of writers in my upbringing. In fact, we were sloppy with diction, and so when you told somebody you wanted to be a writer in my hometown, they'd say, well, why don't you want to drive? Honestly, that whole idea of being a writer was just not. I looked forward, in fact, at one point I perversely looked forward to having a book so that I could go to my hometown where there had never been a bookstore. And there still isn't. But so that from that time, it just then became this force that was pushing me to write about this place mostly. And so I was trying to honor the place and show that I had some small place within the place, so I had some authority to write about it. And the more I put myself in it, the more people who were bomb-proofing it, reading it, including our own Eugenia, were saying, give us more of you. So I joked that I had a little trouble with the me in memoir, a little more comfortable with the moir. But I was writing personal essays anyway, and so it seemed like, okay, let's just see if we can turn this into something. My objective, another thing I really we started my workshop today talking about audience and who we'd really love to have read our work. This book, I could not write it for one audience. I could not write it for my friends in the literary world. I had to write it for them and for the people I grew up with who read no books or one book a year. And so I tried to strike a balance in everything, the way it was done, the material that was chosen, the way I put the sentences together. To be able to, I had this faith that I could keep one foot in both of those worlds. And that faith was shaken again and again and again. But it seemed to have worked out. I found a way to do it. Did that answer the question a little bit? Hi, yeah.
Hi, I think kind of building off of what Sonia asked, in like the first page you mentioned, not only this experience meeting the entrepreneur, but you also talked about, you had all these essays and you put them in a drawer to leave them until the tide was going to turn. So I have to imagine the emotional tie to it had to have been, as much as it was a motivation, was it a strain at sometimes trying to get through, seeing almost like this, what once was like a really prosperous industrial place start to crumble?
Oh yeah, it was. Probably shortly after I left, every trip I made home, which was fairly frequent, it was just sadder and sadder. And so to write about that just seemed to be indulging in a kind of communal sadness, and I couldn't find a healing part of that. And I'm an incurable optimist, and I couldn't find that silver lining. So I think this glimmer of hope made it possible for me to want to characterize it. It's too often, I do say this in the book, I said it with more length and strength at previous versions. Too often people have gone into working class and poor communities and kind of made hay on the stereotypes. And I just wasn't willing to do that. So I was reticent for quite a while. Yeah. Hi. Hi.
So that brings up one of the things I most admire in the book is the way you characterize the other workers. Early in the book, when you have your summer job there, and you have the scene in the bar where he's trying out drinking and all that. I mean, there's real affection there, but there's no condescension, and he's also sort of being an ass, right? So there's all of that going on at once. And I wondered if you struggled with those characterizations, or if they came easily to you, and if you've gotten reactions. I think there's real class tension in the
Mm-hmm.
So were they hard to write, and have you gotten any reaction to how you characterize working people?
Yeah, they were hard to write, and they were, I've gotten good reaction from the people. I also bomb-proofed this book on a blog. I did long chapters, made it available to people in my hometown, because I was really worried about a backlash, about a nasty backlash, about this wasn't where I grew up, but this wasn't for me. And I was overwhelmed at the reaction to, the positive reaction to it. So I think it also helps, excuse me?
Did they correct little things? Did they try to
Not much, no. You know what they did? This is, ultimately, it's all about us, and what they did was added their own stories. And you'll find this if you write about a place or you write about a culture. People can't wait to tell you what their thing is. And that's fine, that's good. And sometimes I incorporated some things or followed a lead. I think when it came to the kind of characters sitting at that bar, I really did resent them at the time. But I think it helped. It helps to be middle-aged and to gain some distance and compassion for people at a certain time in their lives. And if you can do that at a young age, then great, that's terrific. That shows some real maturity. I didn't have it until I was older. I just basically, sort of spit when I think about them when I was younger. The fact that everybody just was trying to pick a damn fight. And I called an old friend of mine who was just an incurable fighter. This guy just, I walked away from so many fights he started. And I asked him, and I think I characterized this in the book, I said, Bob, what is the deal with fighting? I mean, really, he said, for some of us, it's the only way we feel alive. Anybody here like that? You're not going to say, are you? We'll talk about it outside later. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Can you talk about how you chose to structure this? I think you kind of touched upon it briefly, but.
Oh yeah, that was really easy. Oh God. It was like pulling stars out of the sky. It took so many different forms, and I was not satisfied. I thought I needed to be clever and not be chronological, but I like that when people are not chronological, when ideas form in particular ways, and I was kind of in love with that for a while, and so I was trying to fit it into that form. And then it's kind of like, it's like falling asleep at 9 o'clock in the morning and sleeping for 8 hours. You did the thing you're supposed to do at the end of the day and the beginning of the day, and now the day doesn't make any sense. So I started to relax about that and let myself put things into a kind of quasi-chronological order. And that helped me get my arms around it and develop a narrative line. Because essays are not written with narrative as the number one function. And so we've come into a culture that is very story-driven, whether I like it or not. I might like rambling around a little bit more. So then once I saw the larger arc of the story that I was going to just go ahead and begin in the beginning, it was an odd enough kind of story anyway, because who writes a memoir about having a loving family? Unless you're trying to get a script from Hallmark. But was it about place? Was it about history? Was it about blue-collar life? Was it about immigrants? Was it about mobility? It was many things, and so I had to simplify it by giving it a chronology. And then it was a matter of stitching the essays together in such a way that a narrative could develop. So I wrote a lot of the transitions after one summer of having a big long table on my porch and putting each essay down in different orders and tracking characters along. It doesn't look so complicated in the book, but that's the idea. Yeah.
As a follow-up question to that, I mean, do you feel like it was helpful to start with those essays as the seed of what became the narrative structure?
I don't know. I think that if I were convinced that I had a book and I was doing it over again, I might have settled on a structure first and written the essays in between. But the essays kind of came one after the other in an order, one triggered another. And I was insecure about writing about myself. Writing about my childhood. As a personal essayist, I've always written about my ideas, and I've always written about the way I think about myself. But I didn't necessarily write about myself or my family or my siblings and my friends, and certainly not about my sex life. Which, it's a coming of age story, so it had to have that, and I needed to try to find the least icky way to do that. Yes.
As a follow-up question to that, in the title, it's Rust Belt Boy, right? And I felt like there were so many kind of subtle conversations happening about gender in the book, especially considering how masculine the culture was around like the work, the manual labor. So I was wondering if you could just talk about what it was like to be kind of dealing with that in your book, and if you were trying to think about gender in any particular ways within the culture.
Oh, yeah. Let's see. I probably was. I mean, I had this weird thing going on when I was young, and I don't know if this is even in the book. I was just more drawn to the company of women and girls. It's not like I, played dolls instead of war. I played war with girls. They were just as vicious as the boys were. But they were just more curious to me. And so when my friends would be in the library reading about sports and those kinds of things, we all knew we wanted to know girls, even when we were 12 or 13. And I thought, wow, there are all these magazines for girls. Well, maybe I'll just read those magazines. And so I did. And so then I could talk with girls about things they were interested in, or ask them about things they were interested in. And so I did play around, I guess. There was a whole gender kind of open field for me, I think, when I looked back on it. And also, I was kind of at some point, because my brother was a bully, I was impervious to the kind of teasing that went on. So when my friends would tease me for reading Mademoiselle, I would just tell them, "You're crazy, this is great stuff." This is what they're thinking, guys. Is that addressing what you're asking?
Yeah, for sure. I think I was also moved by your depictions of your mother and a lot of the mothers in the town. That chapter particularly, what the mothers put out.
Moms.
What moms put out. And just looking at the different dynamics that you were illustrating in the town about the roles that the women played versus the roles that the men played at the bars and going to the
Right.
workshop.
Well, the women talked. They talked. They sat around tables and talked. And I could sit there and listen to them. I could listen to what they talked about. They talked about like real things. The guys talked about, how to mix cement. And that was interesting to a point. But I had always wished as a writer that I grew up, people talk about coming from a storytelling culture. Does anybody, a background of storytelling? Could anyone here say that? Yes? I always thought, nobody wanted to talk about, they didn't want to tell stories. Then Salman Rushdie said that his storytelling background came from gossip. The he said, she said. And that's what I realized was my storytelling background. And so I listened to these women when they would get together with my mom. And they would talk about one of my favorite things, which was food and cooking. And so I could get involved in that world as well. So I think my mom, my grandmother taught me how to cook, my mother taught me how to cook. And they taught me how to cook because I was interested, because I wanted to do it. And so, yeah, probably my most specific memories are attached to my mother and my grandmother. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that when you were writing the book, you had two audiences, the people you grew up with, and also like your literary peers.
Right.
I'm curious, because I'm going kind of like, what was more important to you? Which audience was more important to you, that they like got the book, or like that they would enjoy it?
Probably them. All of you, I think I trusted that you would value it in your own way. But I wanted it to resonate with them. So, don't you think you walked through some of this with me?
It was easy to resonate, even for not having that experience. It was totally, you made it possible to have that experience resonate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, because even my literary peers, they weren't always, you know? They may too have come from a mill town or something like that. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I wonder, where does embellishment come in, if at all? I mean,
I didn't fucking embellish at all. What are you talking about? That's a really good question. Where does it come in? Like, how much do you allow? How much?
I guess I want to know what your feelings are about it. At what point does it feel honest, and what point does it feel dishonest? And you know, I mean, I'm reminded of, I don't know if you saw it I read a story in the New York Times this week about a Der Spiegel article about a town in Minnesota that was very, very popular story in Europe about a classic American working town.
Mm-hmm.
Completely fabricated.
Really? I did not see this, but I would like to see it.
It was this past week. It's fascinating. I mean, they fired the guy. I mean, every characters were made up. The whole thing was made up.
Oh man,
Story.
I'm glad I didn't see it. That really pisses me off.
It's kind of, it's horrible what he did.
Yeah, okay. That's a great question when writing nonfiction, because I think that unless you do have a really peaked story to tell, and you know it, you will suffer from the insecurity of not having enough drama in your story. And I suffered with that. So a lot of it came from memory, okay? It turns out that the stories we tell our friends and we tell our families about, or whatever is going on with us or had happened, I would write those stories as I had been telling them. And I would visit them in revision a week later or 2 weeks later, and I would be horrified by what bullshit they were. Just varnished, polished, and I'd been telling it that way for a long time. So then I'd write it again. I'd strip off all the egotism, all the other sort of crap. I'd write it again. I'd go on to write other things. I'd come back 2 weeks later, take a look at that passage and say, still aren't getting to it. This is still embellished. This is still decorated. So go, back down, to the point where you think it has no drama or life at all. It's just the dead, cold, hard facts. Well, after I let them sit there a while and it started to happen, it was like, no, this is good. This is better than the crap I've been telling people. And so it was a stripping away. Find that I didn't have to add, I had to get rid of that stuff I've been telling over the years. And so I think my advice would be, you have a better story than you think you do. If you can get your ego out of the way of it, and get your imagination out of the way of it. And then if you feel like it needs a little something, then find those dramatic points. Does that answer? Peeling an onion. I was peeling an onion and I was crying the whole time. Yes.
I just wanted to follow up on that, putting it on the spot. Can you think of a particular scene where that happened that you could kind of tell us?
I'm not even sure I could narrow it down. Really, I mean, if you brought one up to me, I probably could tell you how I used to tell it. But yeah.
Well, how about the guy in the bar who wanted to outdrink you after you'd been in the little hole with the jackhammer?
Yeah, that one, that one, my friend showed up and we fought.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That is a cool example.
And then it was like, no, you didn't. You're a pussy. You don't fight. I never, I never did. You know, excuse my language. Where are you? Where's that iconography when I'm looking for it? Yeah, there was sort of the tussle, and I would downplay that a little bit because it wasn't true. Hi.
I'm curious to hear your answer from this morning at breakfast when I asked you about what's it like to edit yourself in terms of making your story a bit more digestible for your reader. Because I know something that had come up at breakfast was that you kind of come off, I think the word was like a bit of a flare.
Oh, yeah, that word.
For that, is that something that you think about in terms of, you know, how do I make sure people kind of still like me?
Yeah, you know, you don't want to be disliked. You really don't. I mean, I don't want to be. And especially for that. I'm fine being disliked for other things. Yeah, I think that what I really wanted to engage, I really wanted to be sure that the women in the story liked the way they were portrayed. And so, and this was tricky because the Mimi character and I are still very good friends. And I asked her, her name has changed. She asked that I change it. And I realized I hadn't run the manuscript by her at all before I plopped the book down in front of her. And then the Liz character has since died. So I didn't have the chance with her. But I thought about her daughters and her husband and her son. And I thought, okay, let's, and they were really sweet relationships. And I wanted to get to that sweetness. And for that, I needed almost to open the relationships up in the narrative and show more of them and not have them appear as glib kind of passages or rites of passage in my life. I had to make them fully realized characters. Does that answer what you're asking? Yeah, I mean, and so it was less about me in the end and more about them. And also, you know, teenage boys, you know, let's face it, prurience is foremost in the mind often. But raised the way I was, it wasn't. I was as afraid of that as most of my girlfriends were. And so I think that's what made me focus on taking a great deal of interest in them, just what they were all about. And also in things with the hands, I tried to bring that across. So I'll apologize now if you catch me watching your hands, but I'm kind of attentive to that. So I used those things to show that I was trying to look for who they were, as opposed to just what they could bring to me. Yeah, in fact, the main character, Mimi, and I still see her every time I go to Pittsburgh. We still go out to dinner. She has never married. She and I were waiting for a table at a restaurant, and I think the hostess said something to us like, so is this a special dinner? And she said something like, yeah, it's always special. And she said, well, so how long have you been? And I think I looked at her and we said, like 42 years. She said, oh, wow, that's so great that people can be together for 42 years, that people can be married for 42 years. And we both said in chorus, oh, we're not married. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
So, I have a question about the mistrust of intellectualism that was taught to you and how scholarship was to be held very modestly. And I think there seemed to be in reading it an intention to keep any kind of intellectual reference or any kind of historical anything to back, purposefully back. And was that to speak to the people back home? Because, and how is it that you then become a writer? Did they think you were well, too bad? I'm just wondering, how did they receive your choice of career and then this production of this, It just seems like in order to maintain a foot in that world, you have to kind of give up a chunk of your brain, because it seems like it's not trusted. And I was wondering, could you speak to why it wasn't trusted? What
Insecurity is why it's not trusted. And as it turns out, even though it may have been a pervasive cultural attitude that was not necessarily challenged, it's like a lot of these things, the few who set this attitude might be the most vocal, but among them are people who are ready to embrace it. And they turned out in droves in the public library to support the book and me. And yes, I did take certain, it's not like, I did not dumb the book down. But I kept myself from going too far into abstract and intellectual territory. Just the way I also, the size of not only the length of the book, but I asked for the publisher to have the book be a particular size that's not the size of a hardcover, to make it less intimidating. And just the publisher worked very closely with me, and Eugenia worked very closely with me in giving me a product that I felt would bridge that gap. That's what was important to me. And so all those choices I was making pretty consciously. Yeah. It may be my only book ever, so I wanted it to work.
Can you talk more about the bond testing process? So at what point in the process were you posting online? How much did you post? That's such I didn't know if, for some writers who might be thinking about that, the percentage past which it's been deemed to be self-published.
Yeah, right. I ran into this, someone, Eugenia and I went to Bennington with, was running a literary magazine and had asked me for a number of my essays that she had seen, not on the blog that I started here, but on other places where I placed essays that were blogs. And they were blogs. And then when she saw that they were online, she couldn't publish them. And so I was wary of that. They were, I put a lot online first until it sort of caught. And then as soon as it caught, I realized, okay, I'm headed in the right direction. And I took a bunch down. And I kind of put them away into a chapter file and left just a representative number of them. And then when I went for publication, they were changed enough that the publisher was not concerned. And so I was able to get away with that. I think that I'm a huge fan of proliferation. If I ever get a chance and anybody ever wants to serve on a panel with me, if I ever make time to apply to AWP, I will rail against previous submission rules. I don't think enough people see your work. And I love literary magazines in some ways, and in other ways I find that particular thing to be a real sticking point. We live in an age of proliferation. That's what we should be doing, is proliferating. So I felt pretty strongly about that.
Well, as a
Hi.
follow-up, it's really interesting too that, you know, that seeing something on a blog is less intimidating for the readers who you were trying to reach.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so, you know, that was an entry point into
Right.
subject matter that might, you know.
Right. And some people just never buy books. Yes.
So, you said this might be the only book that you write.
Excuse me?
You said this could very well be the only book that you end up
Yeah.
writing.
Right.
Which wasn't lost on me. And the very personal nature of it, the kind of rough and ready, tough and tender, I think kind of encapsulates, I imagine, what this process could have been for you
Yeah.
as well. So why the only book? Why do you think it's the only book?
I think that publishing is just capricious.
Yeah.
I think that, and I also think that, I know this is true in Eugenia's case and it's true in mine, if the book doesn't really mean everything to you, it's not worth doing. It's just not. There's just so much noise out there. There are other ways to publish. And I was happy to, before I published this book, to have published several hundred pieces. So it's okay, you know? I mean, it's lovely to have a book. But if it doesn't really mean the world to you, I don't know how you could bear it.
You didn't answer my question, like, what do your folks think about you being a writer? Did they ever say anything about your choice of career?
Yeah, they, you know, they never really knew what I was doing. I mean, it was surprising to them when I was 26 years old and writing ad copy and making a living by writing 3 sentences a week. That somebody could actually do that. So that was, it's always was sort of a mystery to them. My mother, bless her, when I got into Bennington, I, as you can tell from the book, I did not get my BA and never did get my BA. And Bennington was open enough to accept me on my portfolio. And I was just thrilled, and I called my mother, and she said, well, you always did have the gift of gab. Yeah, it's like, whoa, don't lay it on too thick, Mom. I might get a big head. But yeah, I mean, to go back to that anti-intellectualism, is that familiar with anybody else here? Anybody? That's a tough tide to push against.
And you want to talk about bullshitting then? Your definition of it?
Well,
How they defined it?
hang on, I might do an expanded reading on that tomorrow.
This isn't a question, I'm sorry, I'm gonna be that person, but I just want to say, my dad is from Paw Paw, Michigan, and was one of the people that moved away from the Rust Belt, and your book meant a lot to me, because I had never really been able to contextualize his experience. We live in DC, in like this very educated, liberal town, and my dad, and now my boyfriend, who's from a small town in Wisconsin, like listening to both of them like even talk together about growing up in the Midwest and the things that like even just, you know, saying things like yada yada to each other, like, you know, this person was talking yada yada, like, who said that?
Right.
But also the anti-intellectualism and also the masculinity and sort of the gender roles that they grew up with and all that. And I think more than anything else that I've ever read, your book helped me to like sort of understand that, and it led to some conversations with my dad and my boyfriend that I really appreciated. So
Thank you. Thank you.
another audience.
That's, well, you know, it's like people would write after the book came out that this was what took me, it just really sent me to the floor, was that they'd read Hillbilly Elegy, and then they read mine, and then they wrote to me and said, you characterized it better. And so it was like, yeah, well, it's different. He was talking about Appalachia. Although that was a big difference, and I can tell you, have you ever felt like you're railing against the machine? You're that like little person up by a high wall and you're screaming. Well, my publicist brought it to my attention that the Hillbilly Elegies little blurb on the New York Times bestseller list said, this was a characterization of a Rust Belt past. And my publicist said, do you want to do something about that? And I said, what can I do about that? He said, he said, it won't work if I do, but write to the editor of the book review and straighten that out. And I did, and God bless her. I forget her name right now, Pauline, something or other. She's just, and she wrote back, and 2 weeks later, it was changed to Appalachia instead of Rust Belt. So you can win. Yes?
My question was about the contextualization of this in terms of the changes in the steel industry in the period of time that you talked about that so resonate with the counter-narrative that's being explored in the political air now. And I just thought it was so resonant in so few lines how you point to the facts about when those changes began and who they affected. And I kept reading this thinking, how ironic, given who voted for whom from those areas. And then the dating of the publication. I guess where I'm going with this is, you said you wanted people to be made to read this book. I mean, there are an awful lot of people who should read this book.
Thank you. Yes.
To set
I
the
wish they would.
record straight.
I wish they would. I wish they would understand who's there as opposed to what's being portrayed. Donald Trump came to Ambridge during the campaign, and he was defeated in Ambridge in the election. So it's a more complicated story than the press made it out to be. The only positive side of that development was that for years, the book was sort of put together for 3 years before it was published or so. And when I was pitching, I don't know, I think I pitched 60 agents.
Wow.
And the readers would get back to me from the agents and say, the readers were young people from the Radcliffe publishing program, and would say, so Rust Belt, where? And if anything, after the election, I said, they sure as hell know where it is now. I'm sorry, this is the way they know it. And my publisher has asked me to take the platform and write about what's happened. And I just really haven't been ready. I don't understand. I really don't understand. I partly understand, but I don't understand enough. And there's been a lot of noise. A lot of people have tried to explain it. So,
Totally different question.
okay, totally different,
Can I
yeah.
follow up on that real quick?
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, so I'm assuming that your publisher was asking you to potentially comment on some of the race relations. And there's a couple times in your book where you do provide factual information, like the first statistic about like the Great Migration to the North, opposed to the migration out of the Rust Belt.
Right.
And so I was wondering, like, did you go and actually do some research specifically on like some of the race relations and especially like the African Americans that were in that region, or was that sort of things that you had already known, or like kind of did you do any extra work?
I did extra work. If I could have just researched this book for 10 years, I would have done that, and it would have been okay that there wasn't anything in front of you. I love doing research, so I took the hunches I had, and I consulted. I talked with Hispanic and Black families that I grew up with, And we talked about where they came from and how they got there. And it was a supreme irony to me that this was a land of milk and honey for people of color as well, and for people in the South, former slave families. And then it turned into something that was no longer even hospitable toward them. I mean, the black community in Pittsburgh was probably one of the strongest intellectual and cohesive black communities in the country. And that's of what August Wilson came from. And so I knew that. When I went to the University of Pittsburgh, that was kind of my whole life. I fell into the jazz world. And so I still had those contacts. So I knew some of those people, and then I went back and did more as to, how this all happened. So when the 6 million number was kind of calculated, it sent a shiver down my spine that number could be the same. And they kind of came to the Rust Belt. The people of the South came to the Rust Belt for the manufacturing jobs.
I'm
Yes.
just curious, speaking about that, there wasn't much I could tell on when the competition for prices in steel started dropping and basically ended the livelihood there. There was very little other protests or any kind of acknowledgement of what was going on with that as a way where the country was going and why nobody seemed to give a damn that the steel industry was just being, oh well, it's their fault, their prices are too high, too bad, and nobody. And I'm just wondering why, was that going on then, or did you just decide I want to deal with that? Like what was going on in the politics at the time? Like there was no intervention to help the steel industry,
Well, there was. I mean, the unions were fighting for this, and so do you remember the word protectionism?
Yes, I do. I do.
Versus globalism. And so, manufacturers who were using steel wanted the cheapest steel they could get.
Right.
And that was coming from developing world.
Right.
And great. But the developing world was because they were investing in their factories and making things more modern and mechanized, and the American manufacturers were just unwilling to do that and wanting to diversify and get into oil exploration and other industries. And so they basically milked the older industries dry by not investing in them. Yeah. Did you have another question?
It was about what you said earlier, that you need to write the book, probably, I forget exactly how you said it. It has to be the most important thing to you. How do you make it the most important thing to somebody else? The 60 agents that you pitched, for example.
Got him drunk. I don't have a lot of respect for them. But there are good ones, that being said, and some people have been treated very well by them, and I just think it's a really tough world to mix it up in. I think that the only way, and I would defer to some of you about that, really. The only way, it seems to me, is to stick by your story and tell the best story you can. And if they see it, they see it. If they don't see it tomorrow, maybe they'll see it the day after, or the day after that, or the day after that. When this manuscript was approved, I really had the thing sort of sitting for 6 months. Yeah.
I was going to say 2 quick comments and a question. One, I love the chapter about pierogies. I've never actually had one. I almost ordered a plate in Gettysburg.
Well, if you've not had one, you're missing something big.
I know how to get some. And I could definitely relate to what you call like the anti-intellectualism, because I'm the first person in my family
Yep.
and beyond, so
Yeah.
every time I tell them, well, I'm gonna go get a degree, I'm gonna go get an MFA, it's like, what is that?
Yeah,
You have no degrees on there?
Right, yeah.
The question is, you mentioned you were kind of test driving portions of your book on your blog, but then you had to take them down because your publisher was worried about them. They couldn't use any material that had already gone out into the blogosphere. How does that work, since it's like it's your blog, you're the one
Well,
that wrote
yeah,
it?
okay, maybe I didn't make myself clear. I took them down myself before I got near publishing,
Okay, gotcha.
recognizing that might become a problem, having accomplished what I wanted to from the bomb-proofing. I don't know. Anybody else put work out in under your own platform? How do you feel about that? What do you?
I definitely, like, I haven't put stuff up on my blog because I know that I want to try to, like, get published.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, so it's silly that that's considered publishing if I'm just putting it up on my personal blog.
Yeah.
I'm making money from it or anything.
No.
But, like, so I don't put things that I write on there sometimes.
Yeah. It's too bad. You can't. You know.
Because then it's like, it's like it's this double-edged thing, because that's a way to, like, get yourself known. And then if when you do get something published, like, you already have a following.
Right. Yeah.
I think for me, I have some pieces that I wrote on my website,
Mm-hmm.
mostly because the way it's structured, it can't be like traditionally published, if that makes sense. It involved like different videos and kind of drawing from those, and it was like a playlist type of thing. So you can't obviously put an audio clip in a book quite yet, and I know publishers would definitely have issues with using like other artists' work in order to inspire another work, despite the whole I do not own any of the music bulletins everywhere. But my other work, like, I find myself just like putting links to where like they are, and that part of it is kind of disappointing, because I kind of like opening my website and seeing my work there, because it kind of has that feeling like like I did this, I accomplished this on there,
Right.
and it's all me. But putting a link there, it's kind of like, I don't know, it's a double-edged sword, I think,
Yeah.
depending on what you're using it for.
Yeah. And allow me to redirect for a second. There's nothing, I am not a contradictory of myself. And so I'm just going to like spin around here and say, the publishers don't have an easy time either. And they draw these targets for themselves of what works for them and what doesn't. And if you don't fit within those, you just don't fit within those. And that's okay. You just have to learn to accept that. And my work wasn't ready for publication until it was ready for publication. We talked about that in our workshop this morning. The old way of seeing whether you'd get an assignment used to be show me your clips. Well, my editor's fingers are all over my clips. And so sometimes you're just not ready. I think that truth of the matter is rejection is a way of life for us. And if you can't handle rejection, I hate to be this glib about it. You'll learn to handle it or you won't keep writing. But I used to get 3 rejections a day for a while, when I was really aggressively seeking a place for this book. And I'd say to my wife, whoa, 3 today. Yes?
Just on that, can you also, in my own submitting life, I have found that you do end up with threads of meaning from the types of rejection, from what does or doesn't fit. And poetry is different, I know, because I get more of that data because I'm submitting more.
Right, right.
But certain forms will be much more popular, and it's not, it's just information.
It is. And sometimes you're wildly off mark with what you should be sending them. And you don't know it. It is kind when someone sends you a bit of a note and says, this is wildly off mark for what we published. But
even the come close information, they say this came close, or this poem of the 5 was the closest. You know, that's information for
Yeah.
me. I like getting it.
yeah,
I used to edit a pretty big magazine, and some of the more famous people who would send 1, and other famous people would send 5. And I love the people who would send 5 because I realized, even with how famous they were, they knew I wasn't going to take 5. They wanted the information about which of these 5. They actually missed getting that information.
right.
So of course they could send me 1. I was soliciting them. I wanted 1. They sent me 5 so I could reject 4. You know, that's
Right.
pretty interesting.
And-
to get that famous and still.
Yeah, it makes me think that a submission strategy might be to submit to places where you think you might get a little feedback.
Yeah.
So, you know, it feels very hopeful to submit to the New Yorker, but you're not going to learn much from that. But
What kind of feedback did you get from the 60 rejections? I mean, did they say, I love this, but change it and make it a murder mystery or something?
oh, no, that happened when I wrote screenplays. That was like, can you put a monkey in this? You know, monkeys are big this year. And no, I don't think I can get a monkey in there. But no, I got that, you know, usually that the writing was solid. But the subject matter just wasn't something they could imagine positioning in the marketplace. And so I think most of my frustration came not from the way I was writing, but from what I was writing about. I just couldn't capture. I think it sounded trite and like nobody would care. I think that some of them knew that a great number of people, if you're writing about a region and very few people in that region read. You know, I live in New England. There are scads of publishers who want to write about people writing stories about New England because people in New England read. But you know, there was this prejudice, I think, about that part of the world.
But also, I think you raised it, like, nothing really horrible happens. I mean, I kept waiting
I
for
know.
the horrible thing, and it was, like, so sweet.
I know.
No drama, nothing.
I know.
I'm like, damn.
I know. It's like being too pretty, you know. Not that I would know what that's like, but yeah, you're right. I mean, it just was. You know, nobody really says run out and write a memoir about what it's like to come from a loving family. And yet I'm overwhelmed and moved to tears often by people who come to me and say, it reminds me of my family. There were subtle struggles within ourselves, but that's kind of what real life is about. We haven't all been lucky enough to have Mary Carr's life. You know what I mean. You know what I mean. I mean, it's, and there's, whatever your story is, if you find a way to tell it, and people will find a way to relate to it. I had, you know, kind of modest objectives beyond the two audiences and not wanting to bore people. I have an essay about that. Yes.
So when you mentioned earlier too, like you said after this, and then with everything that happened, you know, with the administration, the election and whatnot, publishers were saying, hey, write about this now. How did you kind of stave off that? Did you have any like impulse to say, well, I don't know that I have much to say about it, but it's me getting my voice out there? Was there like kind of like internal monologue there for you, saying, well, you know, I don't want to write something that I really don't have much to say about, just to have my voice heard? Or was it more, no, I'm not going to do that?
When they were coming back to me saying, what?
You said earlier something that your publishers were asking you, especially after,
To write
you know,
editorials.
the man was.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, to talk about it because yours had such support into the election.
Yeah.
I mean, was it kind of, did you have any qualms about, well, I don't have much to say, but maybe I'll just get my voice out there?
Oh.
Or was it a hard no, like, no, I'm just gonna stay with
Yeah, I think it was kind of both, you know? There was an avalanche of possible explanation and apology, or whatever it was, coming from that particular disaster. And I was searching for the right word. And yeah, I didn't have a sharp enough perspective on what happened to be able to fairly characterize it without, again, stereotyping the people I came from, because it was more complicated than that. And I think we still don't totally understand it.
That'll be your second book.
Yeah, right, exactly. That'll be a while. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, hi.
Can you talk a little bit about how you first got published, your articles and your essays, and how you broke into print that way?
Yeah, I was living in a remote farm in Vermont with not much of a job. My wife had one, but I didn't. I was working at a bookstore, and I started to write book reviews for the bookstore that I did on the radio. And so that was the first thing. And then I knew I'd worked in restaurants off and on. Not too much was covered in this book, but during that time and afterwards. And so I knew the restaurant business. And so I wrote for a restaurant business magazine. I liked that world. I thought it was endlessly fascinating. I think it's, you know, eating is actually the most intimate thing we do 3 times a day. And we consistently now do it with coming from hands we've never seen and never will see. And so writing about that world really swept me up. And so for 18 years, I was a contributing editor to food and restaurant magazines. And I wrote columns, so essays, and then after, you know, writing a column every month is a great discipline. If you can get a gig like that, no matter how much it pays or doesn't pay, do it. And then the essays just started to grow into more personal things and bigger ideas, and so I wrote for bigger circulation magazines, usually around the food world. Bon Appetit, Eating Well, places like that. And I had a good writer's life in that I traveled the world with the United States culinary team. And when I decided to write this book, 2 years before, freelancing had gone from me getting $2 a word to pretty much being offered 20 cents a word because magazines had gone down, everything had gone online. It really wasn't working out, and I realized I was covering a world that I was unfamiliar with. I didn't know. I was sitting in commercial kitchens interviewing people, but not working in them. So I said, I'm going to put this all down, put the pen, the keyboard down, and I went to work in a local marché type restaurant, cooking again, and I went to work at the McDowell Colony as a cook at McDowell, which is just down the road from where I live. And so I did that for 2 years and started writing stories closer to more expansive stories about community and food. And I was nominated for a couple of James Beard Awards based on that writing, so I got more opportunities. And then I fell out of, I got this idea for the book, and I thought, okay, my idea of a colony was to go to a cheap motel on the beach off season. Because I live way in the country, and not that you can't get work done there, but I couldn't stay in the work, so I would stay in a hotel room and order pizzas and Chinese food and just work. And so I was starting to write more and more and cook. And I thought, I booked a room and I went to the woodshed to get a bunch of wood for my wife to be able to heat the house while I was away. And while I was getting the wood, I fell out of the woodshed, slipped and fell and broke my wrist. And then I was no good as a cook and I couldn't type. So I took a bunch of these flip charts with me to the hotel, and I started the book with magic markers and flip charts taped to my hotel room. And that was the end of my cooking stint, and I started back to writing. Yeah.
Could
Yeah.
have not been so extremely dramatic about it.
I know. I know. Huh? And, huh? Just right, I know. Exactly. Exactly.
We're not advocating breaking bones.
No, I'm not. You know, these things just tend to happen. And you see how you forget about the drama of these things, and then you're asked. So it does happen. I think, I think one of the things they should do in art school, and probably even for writers, is teach everybody to be a waiter or a cook. Or a bartender. Yes.
So when you were going through your book, I felt like any time that you went to the land of food, that it was providing you a soft place to land. Kind of this like respite between the more difficult parts. Kind of speak to what the language of food was for you for this, and also, you introduce it at the beginning with milk and honey.
Yeah.
Even the way you talk about the steamed milk, it's a very tactile experience of it, and that it's not just in the biblical sense, but what that kind of means to a barista, what it means to you, and the metaphor that it takes on.
Yeah.
So, can you speak more to the experience?
Yeah, you put it really well. It's a soft place for me to land. When chefs came out of the blue-collar world and started to become celebrities, I started to have more distaste. And not just the chef thing, but when people started to drive 50 miles for Talamanca peppercorns and crap like that, I got really crazy with what was happening, the fetishizing of food.
Yeah.
And so in this book, I knew I could go there, and I have gone there. And I'd written a fair amount of that kind of thing, but I had written when I left writing about food in particular, still stayed with the business side and the chef side, I wrote this one essay that you can find online. It actually published in two places at once, one in an online journal called Pop Matters, and the essay there is called More Than a Mouthful, another weird title, and the other version is called Shut Up and Eat, and it is about the fetishizing of food and my disgust with it, and my public, although who knows how many people saw it, my public walking away from writing about food. Oddly enough, I'm finding myself called back. Just because. But it was a place I was careful not to go too much, because I wanted it as a soup song.
It was helpful to the storytelling, and because we were talking about it earlier, that there's culture in food, and it's the way people communicate with one another, especially in families where sometimes they can't verbally do it. So they'll be passive aggressive with how they ask for certain things, or the love will come out, and it's this whole interplay that I felt like you captured with that.
Yeah, there's more to say too. I mean, if you start talking with anybody about food, If we started right now, just got into it, we could go until the end. I mean, it just happens that way. And there is so much that happens. My sister-in-law died a few years ago, and everyone in our culture inundated us with rigatoni. Okay? And rigatoni and red sauce, and it just kept on coming. It was coming in sheet pans. And the thing about rigatoni is that the more you eat it and reheat it, it sort of keeps growing. So the family had this, we were all sitting around exhausted from the funerals and what was going on, what had been happening, and all this food that we had everywhere, and all of us averse to waste. And we just got into a knockdown, drag out. And my wife says she said it, but I think I said it. I said, I don't think this is about the rigatoni. And that is the thing about food, is it does allow you this sideways into things. And I, there was probably my biggest literary splash was as a cook. I was cooking at McDowell, and a journalist came to write for a magazine called Gastronomica. Do you remember that? That was like Ritz-Carlton food porn. And there was like a profile of McDowell's cooks, and there I was in the first 8 paragraphs. The guy so badly misspelled my name that you couldn't even find it on an internet search. And, it just was one of those strange kinds of things. But does anybody else here cook? Yeah? Yeah, but so few. Everyone's so modest. Everyone's so modest. Yeah. Yeah. But thank you for recognizing that. It was a place where I felt like I could say certain things. Moms Who Put Out is particularly evocative of that. And again, you think it's kind of only in your culture, and then people from all cultures tell you this is going on, that this is what they want. And it's true about the men too. I mentioned the men have this kind of pride in culinary explorations, and I think more now, wouldn't you say? Because it's okay.
It's not just relegated to knives and fire.
Yeah.
Right, it's not just knives and right. It is.
That's how I started cooking. I started watching, Parts Unknown and No Reservations and all that. Now,
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you were to track my food writing and Bourdain's fame, when Kitchen Confidential came out, I hated that bastard so much. Because talk again about the drama. I mean, I'd done so many things in the kitchen that he'd done, but not heroin. So I'm like nobody. I can't write. Forget about the fact that I was half the writer he was. But yeah, and it's just one of the first national pieces I wrote was about the myth of the fat chef, and what that led into was actually the lifestyle of chefs, and the lifestyle of chefs is not particularly healthy. They're not heavy anymore, by and large, but they're strung out in a lot of cases, and so that was the first time I sat in a National Public Radio studio to be interviewed for a story, which felt really great. And unfortunately, I had to tell them stories about chefs that nobody really wanted to hear. That drug addicts are making your food. But yeah, the world has changed along those lines.
Can you talk about the title, where that came from?
Yeah. I had no other title, that's why. I wish I had some of the old titles. There was a title called that was just called Bridgers at one point.
Oh, that's right.
And it just didn't say enough. And then, this is some of the agents, readers would be back to me like, what makes you the Rust Belt boy? And I'm like, I'm not saying I'm the Rust Belt boy. Yeah. I was like, come on. It's like, you're a man, you're not a boy. Why are you saying boy? Well, it's about a boy. So there were all kinds of things like that. Titling was very difficult, and which was new for me because, does anybody else do this? I admit I've written essays where I started with the title. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Because there's a kernel there that really means something. And Moms Who Put Out is a good example. But man, when you really don't know what you're trying to, what the focus of the story is, it's really hard to title something. So I struggled when it's mostly history. What do you do with that? So it was a long slog.
So why stories then?
Ooh.
Yeah, as opposed to memoir
And an
or
American
Ooh.
yeah, what's up with that?
Ooh. Ow, ow, ow.
I was asking, sorry.
No, I'm glad you did. Partly because in order to turn it into a cohesive narrative, I knew that they needed to be as much stories as essays. They needed to be narrative-driven essays, if that's a term. I think it might be. And so there had to be narratives within them. So they were almost as much stories as they were essays. And I'm through the whole thing tweaking Annie Dillard. Yeah, her book, An American Childhood, because that book really rubbed me the wrong way. Yeah, because it characterized Pittsburgh as that one side of Pittsburgh. And when I quoted her in the beginning, I was really hoping somebody would show it to her, because I would have even taken a fight with her. And I admire her work, I really do, but that's beside the point. I mean, for decades, people knew Pittsburgh by the way she characterized it in An American Childhood. And when she said those words, that we never went into those neighborhoods, I thought, okay. And that was part of the driving force behind the book, too. It was kind of like, okay, we're going to present the other side now.
That confused me.
Why it was there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad it didn't put you off. Well, you were forced to read it. His prologues are a little bit confusing anyway.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
Anybody wants to?
Yes.
How did your wife feel about the book?
What's that?
Your wife, the woman you're married to?
She saw a number of versions, and then I kind of let her off the hook for a long time. And until it was going off to galleys, and she said, "Am I in it?" I said, "You have a page to yourself." And then I said, she loves it. She really does. Her opinion was in there, in the beginnings of it. And I think that she could only share so much of my frustration. And so I stopped sharing. And, you can only ask so much of a spouse. And sometimes you have to carry it yourself, or force your friends to carry it. But she likes the small amount she has, and how it all goes. And And she's just, she was, at the time that I was really pushing to get this written and finished, she was finishing her PhD, so we were kind of going in same directions. She finished the PhD far before I had it published. Yeah, thank you so much for this discussion. Thank you. This has been really gratifying. Thanks.